Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th edition of the Cairo Talks on Transformation and Change. My name is Florian Kostal, head of Freie Universität Berlin Cairo Office. Tonight's talk is dedicated to the state of the Egyptian economy and its challenges after the uprising. I'm proud to present to you on my left-hand side Dr. Samra Atallah. He is Associate Professor at the American University in Cairo. Prior to joining AUC, he has taught economics at McGill University, Canada. His research focuses on the economic performance and political transition. For example, one of his last papers is, I think, on the economic foundation of dictatorship. He has also published on trade and tariff policies and environmental policies. We are very happy that you made it today. Thank you for coming, and we very much look forward to your talk. Let me just introduce also Dr. Stephan Roll. He's a research associate or a research fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. He's also a member of the research project Elite Change and Social Mobilization in the Arab world. And before joining SWP, he was an adjunct lecturer at the University Nuremberg-Erlangen. And he also was a DAAD scholarship holder, I would say, and he has published working papers, etc., mainly on business elites, Islamists as well, and international aid. And on the agreement of both speakers, Dr. Stephan Roll is going to start today. Both of you have 15 minutes for your presentation, and then we hopefully will engage in a very controversial and fruitful discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Florian. Thanks, of course, first and foremost to the DAAD who financed this event. I was told by several colleagues that the transition talks have developed to a real institution here in Cairo for academic exchange between Egypt and Germany, so I'm really glad and proud to be part of it. What I'm not doing to do here is to give you a more or less comprehensive overview about the economic situation, because I think 15 minutes would be much too short to do that. But I would like to share with you more questions and worries I'm confronted with in my discussions with political decision makers in Germany, with members of the administration or members of the German business community. And I think there are mostly two sets of questions or topics I hear in my conversations, which are related to the financial situation. I think this is the hot topic in these days. What's about the Egyptian budget? What's about the Egyptian state finance system? And the second set of questions is related to the future direction of the economic policy. Firstly, as I said, there are questions about the finance situation. Of course, all of you are aware of the very difficult economic situation in Egypt, and many observers are struggling to analyze how difficult and dangerous the situation really is. In other words, the budget situation is not very transparent, I think. We know that Egypt has received billions of US dollars from the Gulf, from Arab Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Altogether, nearly 15 billion have been pledged since July this year. How much of this money and aid has really been transferred to Egypt, funds to stabilize its foreign exchange reserves? As you probably know, here the situation is very urgent. Since 2011, Egypt has lost more than half of its reserves. Now I think we are talking about 18 or 19 billion, so it's really not a lot. Maybe it's less than to finance 3 months of imports. On the other hand, the government uses the funds to finance its expensive fiscal policy. And yeah, this is a kind of double use, which for me is somehow a miracle. In any case, I think more questionable is how long these external funds will secure the survival of the Egyptian economy, or to put it another way, how long Gulf countries are willing to pay. And of course, this question from the question from the Egyptian perspective is whether there are other possibilities to secure the solvency of the Egyptian state. From my point of view, such an alternative would be clearly the IMF loan. As you know, it is highly discussed here in Egypt. It has been highly discussed here in Egypt since 2011. There were two situations, I think in 2011 and 2012, Egypt was very close to accept the conditions which are connected to the loan, but in both situations, in the last moment, I must say the Egyptian government refused to sign the loan agreement. And the current political leadership, as well as its predecessors, are arguing an IMF agreement on the ground, are arguing against this agreement on the ground that its conditionalities would harm the poor. Whether this is true or not, I think we can maybe discuss about it later, but I think personally, I don't think that this would be an inevitable consequence, but this argumentation, and I think this is the more important point now, is that this argumentation suggests that Gulf aid has no conditionalities. Formally, this might be right. In fact, I think things aren't always what they seem. It, from my point of view, makes sense to look much more on the question of what kind of interests or motivations Gulf monarchies have to help the Egyptian government, and two motivations are widely discussed in the Egyptian public as well as in the Western media. First, the three Gulf states hope to have Egypt as an ally in the Gulf area at a time when US interests in this area are fading away and being replaced by a drive to restore relations with Iran. So this is one motivation, one very obvious motivation. The second motivation is that in the Gulf there is a great, huge fear that Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt would empower the Islamist opposition in the three Gulf states. Here I'm not sure whether this motivation is correctly described, because I think in reality it's not so much the fear of Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, it is, there is a lot of fear of Muslim Brotherhood, but given that Gulf monarchies are absolutely non-democratic systems, I think that the motivation here is maybe not to have, let's say, more democratic Egypt without Muslim Brotherhood. I think this would be naive to say it this way. So I think that maybe in the Egyptian public this motivation really should discuss a little bit more in depth. But more interesting here maybe is that there's a third motivation from my point of view, which explains why Gulf countries transfer so much money to Egypt, and this is probably the most interesting one. I think that the behavior, Gulf countries' generous behavior must be seen against the background of heavy Gulf investments in Egypt. Such investments are hardly reflected by official statistics about foreign direct investment, and such statistics always Europe and the US are playing the minor role, the major role, and Gulf countries playing the minor role. But a quick glance at the ownership structure of important private companies in Egypt is enough to understand that financial interlocking between the Egyptian business elite and their counterparts in the Gulf countries is much higher. Famous business families like the Kuwaiti Kharafi family, which owns Americana, the Saudi bin Laden family, which has a very important share in the Talat Mustafa group, businessmen like Hossein Sajawani from the United Arab Emirates with Damak, and also Hassan Shabatli, who owns City Stars. These are all examples for very important businessmen from the Gulf countries who are heavily invested in Egypt. And in this connection, for me it was very interesting to see that Osama Saleh, the current investment minister, said that total cumulative Arab investments in Egypt to date have reached 50 billion US dollar, compared with roughly 47 billion in foreign investments, Western investments. Given the many shareholdings of Gulf investors in Egypt companies, this seems, from my point of view, not unrealistic that we are really talking about more than 50 billion. Regardless, it is highly probable that such important members of the Gulf business elite have influenced their respective governments to undertake all necessary steps to secure their business interests here in Egypt. And having these three motivations, especially the third motivation, in mind, I would be careful to argue that Gulf aid is unconditional, in contrast to the IMF loan. The current as well as future governments will probably have the Gulf interests in mind, and I think especially the third motivation is here the main thing which drives or will drive Egyptian economic policy. This can maybe over the middle and long run also harm Egyptian interests. For example, the invalidation of Mubarak-era privatization and land deals, which would be a disadvantage not only to the crony capitalists of the old regime, but also for their respective partners from Arab Gulf monarchies, has become, from my point of view, more unlikely. So in the end, I think the rejection of the IMF loan and the decision in favor of Arab Gulf aid has not so much to do with conditionalities, but more with political preference. It's one of the main spoilers of economic development. And it is, from my understanding, when I talk to business, to members of our business community in Germany, it's really the main spoiler for investing. There are several institutions in Egypt established to fight corruption, and the most important is the Raqaba al-Idariya. I think you can translate it with Administrative Control Authority. And this authority, and this is really interesting, is controlled more or less by the Egyptian military. The chairman of Raqaba al-Idariya is always a general. My impression is, to say this very, very outspoken, that this authority knows a lot and that it could be a very efficient tool to fight corruption. However, my impression is that there's not enough political will for using this authority. And when I have the time, I would make some remarks to the second group I outlined, the business elite. I think it is quite obvious that the business elite has preserved its dominant role through the revolution until today. Its influence on political decision-making had two different effects under Mubarak, and I think we see this today as well. Firstly, it prevented the emergence of free and above all fair competition. Inadequate market oversight enabled individual entrepreneurs to establish monopoly structures, oligopoly or monopoly structures, and I see not that the current government is really interested in tackling this problem. And the second effect of big business influence was the insufficient social balance of Egypt's economic policy. Under Mubarak, the regime attempted at least to calm down the social tension by operating this very costly subsidy system, which is really limiting the room of maneuver, the room for making economic policy for the Egyptian state. I think more than 1/3 of the Egyptian budget is spent in the subsidy system. But the government avoided any kind of real redistributional policy. And if I read statements of policymakers today, I hear exactly the same argument I heard also in past. This is not the time to talk about redistributional policy, like a progressive income taxation. I know that this is put in the new constitution, but I'm not very optimistic that it will also put in praxis. From my point of view, it is exactly the time now to talk about such steps, and here I would make a full stop, and I think I will give it to Sama.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stephan, for a very interesting and comprehensive first input. I think you really made a good mix between numbers and arguments, and you provided us with a lot of interesting points, food for thought for the discussion. I will not go into detail now. I will give the word now to Summer, and then we will discuss both inventions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As an economist, I should talk more about numbers, but I'm not going to do that. So that's just a spoiler alert. And I'm not going to predict the future because as economists, we're very bad at it. So that's another spoiler alert. My main argument today is to avoid the snapshot that we're living in today. I'm not going to talk about the state of the economy today because that you'll hear on every TV show, on every newspaper. The budget deficit is very high, the external position is dreadful, the foreign reserves are shooting like no other day. But I'm going to try to explain to you why we are here today and where we're going to be. And my main hypothesis is that the current political turmoil and its repercussions on the economy and the repercussions of the economy further on the political scene are basically because we are in a position where the social contract between Egyptian citizens and the Egyptian state has collapsed. Since Gamal Abdel Nasser took over power in 1952 and established the Egyptian Republic, the Arab Republic of Egypt, in 1954, his social contract had some sort of a legitimacy. And it continued up to 1967, where its legitimacy was questioned. But with the 1967 war, this social contract regained some sort of renewed legitimacy. The current, and Mubarak continued with the same some sort of social contract. My main argument is that what I call the July-October state, the July-October social contract has collapsed. And it cannot continue. And we as Egyptians, we need some sort of new social contract. So I'm going to start by explaining what are the key elements that existed and is still existing, unfortunately, in this July-October social contract. There are basically, in my opinion, 4 key elements of them. The first key element in this social contract was public employment. The government was responsible for employing almost all graduates coming out of university and higher education into its employment system. That's one thing. The second element of the social contract is subsidies, the massive subsidies to support poor Egyptians. And the third element to fund this public employment, this large bureaucracy and this large bill of subsidies was borrowing, because the resources of the Egyptian economy were not able to cover these 2 expensive items of expenditure. And the fourth element is to oppress any dissident, any voice that had some objections on this social contract were faced with oppressive regime, either through its Ministry of Interior arm or through its military arm. I'm going to go over each one of these elements of the July-October social contract, and I'm going to explain to you why each one of these elements can no longer sustain this social contract. The public employment we have in Egypt about, in the ballpark, again, the statistics in Egypt are reliable as the weather. So we have in the ballpark of around 25 million in the labor force. 7 million of them, plus or minus a million there, a million, are government employees. They are working in the public sector. And this is a habit that Nasser kept, Sadat kept. Actually, one of the things that is a bit surprising that Sadat was the pioneer of the open door policy. As a percentage, the largest increase in public employment was during Sadat, as a percentage. Sadat kept this tradition, Mubarak kept this tradition, and even Morsi kept this tradition. This public employment, because it has a political element, patronage. And this is something it's well established in the political economy literature, that politicians hire employees in the public employment system in order to gather public support. And there are lots of very interesting, very interesting results that show that prior to election year, you'd find the public employment increasing. And it's in Egypt, it's elsewhere, it's in Italy, it's in Latin America. It is almost a fact that politicians use public employment to gather support. In an autocratic regime where there are no elections or fake elections, the only thing to guarantee loyalty and clientism was to hire people in the public employment system. I have a paper that I co-authored with my colleague from AUC, Mohammed Al-Asas, and we look at the results, the election results of the presidential election results of 2012. And it's going to be very interesting that we find that districts that had the highest percentage of public employment as a ratio of total employment were the districts that supported Ahmed Shafiq as a representative figure of the Mubarak regime. Very strong evidence. The second element of the July-October social contract was obviously the subsidies. For every pound the Egyptian government spends, 30 cents goes to subsidies. The bulk of these subsidies are obviously the energy subsidy. Okay, we spend in the hundreds of billions of pounds on energy subsidy. I would like to ask you to do a little exercise. Those of you who own a car, every time you fuel gas, you pay 185 piasters, £1.85 piasters. Please remember that the Egyptian government is giving you £4 in your pocket for every liter. So that's how massive the energy subsidy is in Egypt. Obviously, it's massive. The employment costs money. You need some sort of finances. In a rentier state where the government does not collect taxes from income, does not collect sufficient taxes from consumption, it only can only finance this large bill of expenditure through borrowing. Again, Nasser did it, Sadat did it, Mubarak did it, and Morsi did it. It is the only way you can finance this big machine. And they alternated the ways of borrowing. Sometimes it's fancy to borrow from the outside. Nasser did it, Sadat did it. Mubarak continued to do it. And sometimes you feel that the external powers are exerting too much power on you. So what do? You stop the foreign borrowing and you go to the domestic borrowing. And both of them are, in terms of economic consequences, two sides of the same coin. Okay? With different channels of their implications on the macroeconomy, but it's the same thing. Okay? The implications on inflation from domestic borrowing are obviously well documented and well substantiated by evidence. The evidence on the exchange rate from foreign borrowing are obviously something well established in economics. So this is how we kept the machine. And every time we're on the verge of collapse because we borrow too much, somebody kind enough, a stranger comes in kind enough and says, "Khalas, you don't have to pay, but please don't do it again." And yet we do it again. So if my memory serves me right, prior to the first Gulf War, the Egyptian economy was on the verge of a collapse because its external position was very bad. We participated in the Gulf War, which was called the Kuwait Liberation War, whatever they call it, it's still a war. And we were relieved of 50% of our debt. When Sadat, after 1973 war, we were also on the verge of collapse because our external position was very bad. Somebody came and said, "Khalas, please don't do it again." And so on and so forth. So the external borrowing, the domestic borrowing, it's a time bomb. It's going to explode sometime. Our banking sector has a massive, and this is again a surprising piece of evidence, has a massive large of deposits in a well-functioning economy. Where do these deposits supposed to do? It's supposed to finance people that are entrepreneurs. It's supposed to finance small and medium enterprises. It's supposed to finance infrastructure. But what does it do? It finances the government debt. It finances the government borrowing. What does the government borrowing do? It puts the £4, it gives you the £4 when every time you fuel gas. In a nutshell, but it does other things obviously, but mostly it does that. So you want to keep everybody happy, you give them jobs, you give them cheap food, you give them cheap gas bottles, you give them cheap gas, khalas, they should be okay. But if somebody says, no, this cannot continue, what do? You apply the fourth element of the social contract, which is the oppressive regime. The oppressive tools of the military police, the oppressive tools of the Ministry of Interior. You build prisons, as they're going to, I don't know if you follow the little news that nobody talks about, but they decreed that the Ministry of Interior can build now new prisons because obviously everybody they're arresting now, there is no much space, so they're expanding in the prisons. So this oppressive regime, again, Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, and Morsi. And obviously in the middle, the SCAF. And even during Morsi, where our hopes were very high that this is our first democratically elected president, civilian president, would contain this oppressive means of the state. But obviously, he only learned from his oppressors to oppress also. And they claim that this is democracy, this is, we came through the ballot box. My friend Amr Azzat, who is a columnist in Al-Masri Yom, has a very nice terminology. It's in Arabic. He calls it sanduqratiyya, which means boxomocracy, which is democracy that only relies on the box or the ballot box. So obviously, these traits did not change, which leads us to the current picture, to today. Why is this social contract failing? Why? I mean, why can't we just continue like business as usual? We've been doing this for the past 60 years. And why the change? Well, because these four elements are failing. Okay? The public employment ceased, I think 10 years ago. They stopped employing people, but they only employed the cronies. So they only employed the ones, it's no longer a guaranteed employment from the state to all graduates. If you have a connection, you'll be guaranteed employment. The first thing that Morsi did, he employed his cronies. He flooded the system. I don't want to say flooded, but he flooded the system with his supporters, again, because this is where he learned how to do politics. But the most important reason why this type of employment failed is because the massive inequality in the salary scale. So this bureaucracy, it's a whole black box when it comes to salaries. You may find someone that is doing the same job and earning £10,000, and his colleagues right next to him would earn £200. Just because the one who's earning £10,000 has a way with the boss, knows somebody, and it's completely obscure, completely not transparent, but this is how it works. So this scheme is no longer functioning because people are resenting the horrible scale of salaries. Okay. One reason what Stephan called the populist minimum wage, because it came to a certain period that people are earning 200 pounds per month, and this is obviously not sustainable in the current conditions. And they know of people who get millions per month. Okay, so that's one reason this public employment system failed. The second thing is the subsidies. Okay, the subsidies is a classical example of false targeting of a social policy that target not the poor, but it gives the rich. Okay, the energy subsidy goes mostly to heavy industries, to the industrial sector, to energy intensive, to the rich people. Okay, I don't know if you notice what is your natural gas bill that comes into your house. I bet you it doesn't exceed 10 pounds per month. Bet you. Okay, anybody here exceeds 10 pounds per month? You even get it for free, don't even know how much it. So that's how upper middle class should not be paying 10 pounds per month for natural gas. Okay, and it has an implications on the gas bottles. The gas bottles are gas bottles and the diesel are two key commodities for lower middle and lower classes of the society. They cannot live without these two. So if the government is giving us natural gas for 10 pounds a month, it's probably taking away from those who cannot live without gas bottles and the diesel engine. Again, it is an example of how a state should not function, how a social policy and economic policy should not do the energy subsidy. Now, when it comes to borrowing, we've reached the limit. We can no longer borrow. Our banking sector can no longer borrow because the interest rate is too high. Like we're basically borrowing to pay the previous debt of the previous borrowing so that it accumulates more debt, and at a certain position we have to borrow more to pay the previous debt. So it's a vicious circle of borrowing for the sake of borrowing for the sake of paying previous debt. And this vicious circle is not sustainable. Okay. Today, the Gulf countries came and gave a tap on our shoulder. Khalas, we're going to support you this time, but please don't do it again. And this is a classical example of moral hazard. You know, it's like a CEO in a financial company. He takes or she takes a very risky bet in the stock market, and when the stock market fails, this company is too big to fail, so somebody comes for the bailout. Do you think he's going to stop doing this? Of course not. He's going to do it again. So exactly the same thing with debt relief and borrowing. Now, the tool of oppression is also failing because people have decided that this enough is enough. On the 28th of January 2011, people stood against the oppression of the Ministry of Interior. Because the social movement on the street is much stronger than the oppressive tools of the state. And the youth bulge that we have, the median age in Egypt is 24. So 50% of the Egyptian population is 24 or less. And these, for them, the fact that a military, or sorry, not a military, a police truck would go into a university and fire a tear gas bomb is something not acceptable. And they will continue to resist this. So that the cost of oppression is increasing day by day. And it's also not sustainable. Now, what next? We have a social contract that is a complete failure. And we have people in power that would like to maintain this social contract because lots of vested interests. And we have citizens that do not accept the social contract any longer. And they will continue to resist. They become patient. They stay at homes for some time and they give the chance. But if they think that it is business as usual, they will come back to the streets. And with the lack of political channels through which these different conflicting interests can debate and come to a consensus about policy, the only venue to voice anger and to voice economic and social demands is the streets, the university campuses, the factories, and so on and so forth. So I told Stephan I will try to give you a positive note. But my positive note for you is that it's going to continue. Because this is the only way out to establish a new social contract. We cannot continue business as usual. Now, why is it that people did not learn the lesson of January 25th, 2011? Why is it that Morsi did not learn the lesson of January 25th? Because there are vested interests that do not want to establish this new contract. And I would like to echo what Stephan said. The military has both political interest and economic interests. Okay? The empire, the economic empire, obviously it's very difficult to estimate how much it is big in the Egyptian economy. But these are vested interests. It has also political interest because it does not trust a civilian, that's it. And Morsi proved them right, unfortunately. That a civilian rule over military, nah, we don't like it. Khalas. And you can see that in the articles of the constitution, that's something that the military does not want. So the second class of vested interest that does not want a change in the social contract because it would come at the expense of its economic benefits is obviously the business elites, the people that made lots of money during Mubarak, and the social contract would definitely come at their economic expense. They do not want their interests to be touched. Now there are rumors circulating, and they were reported by Al-Masri al-Yawm, that it was supposed that the interim president, Adli Mansour, was supposed to call for a vote for the constitution. He received the constitution, I think, a week ago now. Morsi, once he received it, the second thing in the morning before showering, he just issued the invitation for people to go vote. Morsi, what's his name now? Mansour had the constitution for 1 week now. Now, Al-Masri al-Yawm reported that people are angry because there are 2 clauses in the constitution that set the minimum expenditure on health and education. 3%, if my memory serves me right, and again I said I should not state numbers, but anyway, it's around 3 or 4% of expenditure on health and 3 or 4% expenditure on education. The vested interest freaked out. This is lots of money. You're going to spend 3% of your GDP on education? You cannot do that. So what Al-Masri al-Yawm reported is that maybe we should not really put this on to vote because maybe we don't want that. We don't want the state to spend money on education or health. We don't want the state to spend 3% of its GDP on a country where education attainment is 6 years. The average person in Egypt has 6 years of education attainment. 6 years. The average person in Germany, I believe, has 15 years of education attainment, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it's big, so it's much larger than we have in Egypt. So that's just a very small example to show you that there is a social movement that has social and economic demands. It is in the street. It will continue to demonstrate in the street. Now it's patient because there is money coming from the Gulf, and it's kind of taming the beast. But once this money runs out, and once they will not be able to find a decent job, a decent standard of living, they'll go back to the street. And that's the positive note I have for you.
Yeah, Dr. Thomas, thank you very much for especially ending on this positive note. I think we need it after both of your presentations. I think, let me just sum up a bit. I think both presentations added up quite well. Dr. Sama, you were focusing on the social contract, which was in fact a very important concept also in the study of authoritarianism. So I'm quite curious to hear from you if you think also that we continue with another social contract or if there has to be something new. And Stephan, you gave us a lot of insights on the current state of the economy, from what policies are applied at the moment, what is the leverage of politicians, what is the role of corruption, what is the role of foreign aid. So many different aspects which I think add up very well. If I find a common point between your both presentations, it's actually that economic decisions here are taken completely under political constraints, or it's completely the political that prevails over, there's no economic rationality, if I sum up both of you, to economic decisions which are taken. You, Dr. Samar, you said it at the end, but I think Stephan, he really emphasized it, is the changing role of business elites in Egypt and their leverage to influence these economic decisions. And I think this is really a very interesting point to continue the discussion. Also, I mean, we have now lived 2.5 years of transformation in Egypt. We have lived different phases. Both of the two constituencies have a link to business elites. So I think it would be very interesting to hear more about how these business elites are really challenging, on the one hand, the social contract, and on the other hand, the ratio of economic policy making, in the sense that it's not anymore only that political interests that can prevail over economic decisions, but probably also the economic that must be taken more and more into account now. But before you might respond to my remarks, I would like to open up the debate now and give the floor to the public. Yeah. Dr. Hasan?
I have a question for Samar.
Yeah. Could you please, for the speakers, identify yourself? Thank you.
My name is Hazem Abdellatif in Shams University. Dr. Samar, you talked about the social contract, and also you talked about subsidies. These are some elements of the economy, and you talked about borrowing. But you didn't talk about population growth. I think that population growth is one of the major problems that the Egyptian economy is facing. A long time ago, we had a cake, and 4 people were eating that cake. Now, we have the same cake, but 4,000 people are eating it. So we either increase the size of the cake or decrease the number of the people eating it. And I think one of the major efforts that we have to do is to control, to have birth control. And we have to control the population growth. We have many people, the young people are frustrated. They graduate from universities and they don't find jobs. After a long time educating in schools and universities, they end up sitting in cafes, and they don't contribute to the economy, to the Egyptian economy. So I think one of the major steps that we have to take is to do something to control population growth. I need your comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Irene Baghdadi from Nahdlatul Mahrousa. I'm interested to know Professor Samer's opinion on what Dr. Stephan had mentioned about the role of the military and the 40% versus the 6 to 10%, and the discrepancy that exists and why it exists.
Yeah, my name is Christian Achreiner. I work for another Berlin-based think tank. And my question is not necessarily addressed only to Stephan, but is based on Stephan's intervention. You mentioned 2 different actors inside the Egyptian economy, which is the military and the, I would call it, old business elite. But I would be interested in your thoughts or about the Ikhwani business people. What is their role? How big is their share? And how are they doing at the moment? I mean, how are the how are they currently performing?
One more question probably for this round, otherwise I think Stephan, maybe you can start with this rather large question.
Ikhwani business elite? no idea what they are doing now, hiding themselves. I think that their weight has been very, put too much too high. So all the rumors that they are similar to, let's say, established businessmen like Sawiris, Mansour, Swedi, and so on, I think this is nonsense. So to be honest, I don't think that someone like Cairo Chapter or Hassan Malek really own billions, as it was very often published in the Egyptian media. But of course, they also try to get a share of the cake. And probably they tried it too pushy and too quick. But my observation is that at least some of them were quite successful to, let's say, leave the country. I think Hassan Malek is still not imprisoned. He is on the run. I think he is in Istanbul. So they are not...
You know something I don't know.
Yeah, I'm also not sure about that, but I think he isn't imprisoned. So they are still there, but they are not so important as it was described by the Egyptian media. I think this was nonsense. Shall I say also something? I think it was more in your direction, but the question about population growth, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we are talking about a country which will have 100 million people in 2020, so it's incredible big. This is always a message I also give to our political decision makers when we talk on Egypt. It's not Tunisia, it's not a country like Libya, yeah, where we talk about maybe 7-8 million people. It's much bigger, therefore it is so important for us that Egypt does not fail. But yeah, birth control, do you really think that such a policy would be realistic in such a, let's say, cultural setting as we see it here? I don't think so. So of course, maybe the country needs programs to go in this direction, but to force people by law, as it was in China, I think it's highly unrealistic to get this implemented here in this social and cultural context. But it's, yeah.
Well, we are a lot. You can tell from the Cairo streets that we're a lot. Too much for the Cairo streets. And too much for the pie we're producing. That's true. But why are we a lot? Why that we are doubling in size every 35 years? Because the micro decision of having children in each household is driven by poverty. Why do poor households in Naga Hammadi, in Daryut, in Asyut, in the delta of Egypt have 3 and 4 kids? Because they're poor. Why do they produce children? Because they invest in children. Because they don't have a social security or retirement after their age of 65 where they can get a pension that would guarantee them a standard of living. And their only investment is the kid that would support them when they grow. And this is the only investment where the kid would start working at the age of 12 and 13 and 14 and support the family. If I were poor, I would invest in my kids and would have 4 or 5 kids. I don't care about the Cairo streets and how crowded they will be, because this is the only way I would sustain my life. I think from the policy we always look at, let's control the population growth. But my perspective, population growth is a symptom of poverty. Dealing with population without dealing with the underlying reasons of population growth, poverty, illiteracy, lack of educational attainment. Female empowerment, for God's sakes, we have, for every 100 women in Egypt that are in the working age, how many of them work? How many? 22. There is a strong correlation between gender empowerment and population growth. Gender, female employment, and fertility rate. I think, and this is the same argument that, and I'm not trying to imply that you're Mubarak, but what Mubarak said, I cannot feed you, you're too much. Well, do something. It's not my responsibility as a kid that I don't find schooling. It's not my responsibility that in my village, the closest school is at 25 kilometers away and I need 5 means of transportation to go to the school. It's not my responsibility that my dad or my mother could not afford to send me to school, so I have to work at the age of 12. You know, there is something called the intergenerational elasticity of income, how the parents' income is correlated with the children's income. And it's very, very strong in Egypt, because poor children, poor parents lead to poor children who become poor parents who lead to poor. It's the dynasty after dynasty. And obviously those who have 4 children continue to have 4 and 5 children, because you're not dealing with the root problem. And nobody dealt in the past 60 years. Nobody dealt. And it's very difficult to impose a policy. Obviously, due to cultural reasons, it's very difficult to impose a policy. So I agree with you that one-child policy a la Chinese, I don't see it happening in Egypt. But it's very difficult to impose this policy for cultural, economic, and social reasons. And even if you impose it, let's hypothetically think, as we do in economics, let's assume it's possible. It's not gonna give dividends tomorrow. There is a population momentum. It takes time until something gives dividends when it comes to population. The role of the military, it's very difficult to give a number. And I would just like to comment to something Stephan said. Not only they have the means of production when it comes to land, but they also have the other means of production, which is labor. They basically employ all the military conscript for free. Every time you go to Wataniya gas station, the person that fuels gas for you is a military conscript that is supposed to do his job in military service. Every time you buy a pack of macaroni that's packed in a military facility, that's a military conscript standing on the operation line. So that they have, I mean, there is no other word but slavery. These are people who are supposed to do military service, but they're working in a money-making machine for peanuts. I cannot see another word that describes this operation. So they own both, and this is probably why it's very difficult to estimate the size of the economy. It's large, but how large? It's everywhere, but where everywhere? And it is a black box, because this is a military operation. There's no one like KPMG or auditing firms that go, show me your books. No, this is a secret. This is a military secret. So I think it's nearly impossible to estimate the size of the military in the economy. The Ikhwan elites wanted to replace the Mubarak elites. Hassan Malik, just immediately in the first year of the revolution, had a very revealing statement. He said there was nothing wrong with the policies of Mubarak. It was just the corruption. So the policies, the problem with the Ikhwan business is that they didn't have part of the pie. So that now after they came in power, they wanted the part of the pie. I agree with you, they're not as big as the Sawiris, the Mansours, and the likes. But they wanted to be as big. Their aspiration was to obviously to be as big.
If there's no immediate question, I would like to ask one. Because
There's
if
one, I think.
huh?
There's one.
Oh, there is one. Excuse me.
Hello. Yes, my name is Wolf Muth. I'm heading here the local KfW office, from the German Development Bank. I think we heard quite interesting analysis of the economic and political situation here. I think you really made the point. You highlighted the key issues. We've learned about the social contract and the 4 elements. And I looked to my colleague, and we identified, or we also talked more or less about the same issues. And we also learned about the dependency of the funds provided by the Gulf states. And but we also learned, and that's quite important, that this is a system which actually works for decades. So, I mean, we've seen well, either there are funds from the Arab states, either from Saudi Arabia, the next time it's from Qatar, now it's switched back to Saudi Arabia, maybe the next time we get some money from IWF and so on. Pardon? Or from Germany. Well, but in the end, if you compare our funds, it's ridiculous in comparison to the other funds which are playing a role. but if we are looking forward, I mean, there are so much smart people around. I mean, your analysis was pretty much to the point. But the question is how we move ahead. I mean, we can either say, well, system works on for another decade. Well, we have the military playing its role and want to defend its position. We have the rich families, they also want to defend its position. We have now the investors from Saudi Arabia, we have learned. Well, so there's a nice community, they're feeling fine, they're making the profit. Well, there are some poor people in the country. We've learned, okay, they learned to have their power and go back to the streets. But the only thing so far is, I mean, either the guys in the power do really realize, well, the situation is going to collapse, we have to do something, or they're moving ahead. I'm not quite sure what's happening. But the only thing what we've learned is that the people have some power. So they might come back to the streets. There might be another revolution. I don't know. When we have the transitional government is over, we have the election, the next government is. And people are a bit patient, but they see things doesn't develop, so they go back to the street. But actually, there's no big change because the political decision maker, they don't come up with some ideas, or they don't come up with a plan that things will be changed. So I don't know how to influence actually the policy makers. Do we have to wait for the people to go back to the streets, to mass demonstration? Or what else do we have to make the required and the necessary adjustments to the subsidy systems, for example, or to the other policies changes which have to be made. So it's yes, where's the trigger in the end of the day? Because the analysis, I mean, it's perfect, but you've said, I mean, well, it did work for decades, but well, maybe end up with another decade and nothing will happen?
Would you like
to
to
the trigger? Start, please.
You know, in Tunisia, the trigger was a man burning himself. I don't know if another Bouazizi would happen in it, but let me tell you this. As an economist, we think of rationality. My years of experience told me that there's nothing as rational that ever existed, and it's only a model that I teach to my students. You think that those who are in power would have a minimum degree of rationality to understand that there is an underlying change in the society. There is a youth bulge. I was telling them before we came in, I think they're still running the country a la 1965. They don't understand that this new generation can mobilize much faster than they ever imagined. I think, like any major transformation that we know of historically, it's going to take time of back and forth. It's like a box game. You get the hit, you fall, and you stand up, you take another hit. I think it's a major bargaining game. The military cedes some power, people gain some power, the military feels enforced and it takes another piece of the power. I think we're going to be this back and forth on and on until both elements likes to give a chance and wait and then go back. And we're all saying people go back to the street, but the street is not just Tahrir Square. The street is also the universities, the steel mill. They're on strike. There have been a strike for the past week, and it's not in the news. The doctors are voting to go on strike again. The conditions of the medicine profession in Egypt are out of this world. Out of this world. In order to go to do an operation in a public hospital, you need to bring the needle and you need to bring the gloves for out of this world. You would not think this is 21st century. Seriously. And these are the people, the doctors have been constantly fighting for their rights. Sorry, I take a longer in my...
No, but you're absolutely right. I think there are maybe two triggers. One is from inside Egypt, and here I see the things maybe a little bit different, because I think since 2011 we saw so much, we have seen so much dynamism within the Egyptian youth, and this is not comparable to the situation in the 1980s, 1990s, even in the 1970s. So I think here is something in the air, and let's wait and see what we will see in the next year. But I don't see that this was just a quick outcry and now they will calm down. I don't see this. And the second trigger is the external level, of course. Now Egypt gets a lot of money from the Gulf. I don't think that this system can reproduce itself again and again. So when I talk to German and European decision makers, in 2011 all of them said the sentence, Egypt is too big to fail. So they recognized that Egypt is really too big. But now they are saying Egypt is too big to fail, but Egypt is also too big to save. And this makes things, I think, in future much more complicated for the Egyptian side to get unconditional assistance. Yeah, I mean, this is somehow our job to try to push political decision makers in our countries to say, okay, Egypt needs much more money. I mean, what we offered Egypt in 2011, it's really a shaming. I think Egypt needs more money, needs something like a Marshall Plan or however you call it. So I was really ashamed when I saw that we're talking about maybe 100 million or something like that. So it's not what Egypt needs. But on the other side, we have to insist much more on conditionalities. And here I am not only talking about human rights issues, but also about budget transparency and stuff like that. Yeah. So the European Court of Justice made it really clear that all European aid should be much more binded to transparency issues in Egypt, and the Europe administration failed in doing that in past. So here are things we have the trigger in a certain way, and I think we should really try to use it in the next years.
I see three hands. Maybe we start in the back. Yeah, while the mic is.
I have two questions actually. The first one is going a step further on your interventions on the social contract, and you just mentioned the labor unrests and the strikes we've been seeing that I think are important elements that are very often overlooked. When we look at the political developments in this country, we only look on Tahrir Square, but actually a lot of the public services are, I mean, it's surprising that they're still functioning given the given the unrest and the trouble those service providers have, that companies have to actually keep on producing. Now, I sometimes wonder what is the direction of, or what is the public opinion, and where do people want to go in this social contract? Is it that they would like to actually preserve I mean, is it really that people want to change the social contract? I sometimes feel it's more about preserving the old social contract. It's about maintaining the people, to a large extent, still see the state as the main provider of employment, and it's more about, okay, it's unfair. Why am I not getting my fair share? Why are 15% increases per year not automatic anymore? And why can I not live on my salary that I get from the government? But it's not a fundamental questioning of the social contract. And is that really a way Egypt can live on for the next 20, 50 years? So that's my first question. Is this, and the second, or maybe I'll leave it at that. That's fine. If I get a second chance, I'll.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, my name is Agnes Riquier. I'm a French journalist. I had two questions also. The first one is, what is the relationship between business elite from Mubarak era and the actual CC-backed government? Is there an obvious financial support of CC from these people? and which are the channels they use to finance him. And my second question is maybe a bit more theoretical. Given the need for economical improvement to ease the revolutionary spark, why do they keep on organizing elections so close in a time frame? I mean, if the elections are in 6 months, there is no time for economical improvement. How come they continue the same rhythm and they don't give themselves a chance to have economical improvement before elections?
To add another question to make it a bit more complex. You mentioned, Mr. Roll, the conditionality. I mean, we as a development bank, we are dealing with conditionality in our contracts for a long time, and it's a really hard stand to get along with these when dealing with state-owned authorities. And that's actually the issue. I mean, it's not actually the lack of funds, it's actually to get rid of the funds in the way that you can disperse it and use it. And we are now facing a situation where we want to spend the fund, but there is a that is part of the social contract already mentions the bureaucracy and the ineffective way how to deal with this stuff. And this makes it really difficult. And even now with the transitional government, things are, the implementation of the projects even getting worse, more or less, because everybody is now afraid to make any decision at all, and everything is pushed forward to the next government, and the problems are piling up, and everything is shifted to the next government. So this is just with respect to the conditionality. It's actually not a question, it's just a statement.
Okay, as we have statements, I can take 2 more. We have one here in the back, and then well, yeah, pass it just on, so thank you.
Okay, I'm Reem Sherbini from Sawiras Foundation. I know we should think about the long-term goals and policies, and also I know that development is all about alternatives. So what the Egyptian economy or the Egyptian government have to do regarding the short-term demands of the people, given that the military and the elite both won't voluntarily sacrifice their share of the pie? What's next? What is the proper action to be made by the government or the people themselves to reach a better conditions for the short term, not the long term? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Marwa Khairat from CIB, a banker. I'm totally 100% with Mr. Professor Samir, okay, about the social contract. We just want to know clue about the elements of the new social contract, okay. In my point of view, that it should contain obligations. The problem of the previous social contracts was about rights. It's all about rights. We have the right of well education, of everything, but there were no obligations about Egyptians. We need to have a balanced one, which contains rights and obligations. So I just want a clue, yani not a utopian, yani one not rational, not utopian, but one in between. Yeah.
My question for Dr. Stephan and for Professor Samir: what about your opinion in the future of economic? Thank you very much.
Can you hand it on to
My question is about what are the effects of economic studies in declaration, the situation of the economic difficulties or to show the better way to overcome this period. Thank
you. Yeah, question and statement. I would like to ask how you assess the conditions of the International Monetary Fund, because usually the International Monetary Fund likes privatization very much, likes to reduce bureaucracy and to manage everything more effective. And when I look at the structural reform program of the 90s, in which the International Monetary Fund funded and supported exactly that, I think it was a main disaster for Egypt and the current situation, because when we look at Egypt, we have now a country which is highly privatized in many ways. Let's look, for example, at cities like El Gouna or districts as Rihab that are run basically by businessmen that built this kind of districts. So when you have election campaigns, it's not allowed to hang up any posters or flyers of the campaign. And at the same time, we have a business elite, as you mentioned as well, which was basically the main backbone of the whole regime somehow. And so I think perhaps it would be time to reclaim like the public space and put it more back in the hands of the state.
Okay, can we take one more? Is it okay for you? Yeah, okay, so.
My name is Muhammad Salah, business analyst. I want to ask one question. How can we learn from other experiences like Dubai, Hong Kong, and India? And how much time we need to implement any of them? Thank you.
Thank you. I think both of you received a lot of remarks and comments, and I would like to ask you now to respond to them. Maybe I may add one of them, which is also not pretty small, but which is in generally about, you were talking about different forms of international aid, political conditionality, but what is the economic rationality behind the development aid? Is it something that is rather, in your assessment, something to stabilize this social contract, or are there examples where we really can see that it is triggering a growth industry and fostering innovation, independent from the donor, if it's possible to? Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm trying to read my handwriting. So. Do people want a new social contract? Yes. But do they know how does it look like? Maybe not. I think, and this goes back to your question also, I think when people went to the street and shouted the 4 words, عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية كرامة إنسانية, I think they put the headlines of the social contract. They want human dignity, they want social justice, they want bread, and they want freedom. Now, it's not, in my assessment, it's not the role of the people to formulate a social contract. It's their role to voice their need for a social contract. And it's the role of politicians who failed us miserably to formulate this new social contract. And I think, this is my assessment, I'm gonna substantiate my assessment with the World Poll Survey, which is done by Gallup, where they ask people, what do they want? And you find overwhelming majority of the respondents saying, we want social justice. It's not foreseeable that we have people living in cemeteries and people living in gated communities with multiple cars and multiple villas, and people want social justice. Do they want it in the form of public employment? Do they want it in the form of subsidy? They want a new social contract. My argument was that the current social contract does not work. And people are realizing this day by day. Now, we need a new social contract. How does it look like? We don't know. And I'll answer your question. People don't, I know how, I have a vision, but I'm not the prime minister, so that's too bad for me and too bad for, but anyway. And a part of the social contract is rights and obligations. That's by definition of a social contract. That's how it's designed. Okay. Obviously, the state did not revolt against the citizens. It's the citizens that revolted against the state. So that's the citizens, they want their part of the deal. Okay? It's them who had missed their part of the deal. Okay? So that's why my focus was more of the rights of the citizens rather than the obligation. And you don't expect people who are deprived of their humanity to fulfill any obligations. I don't think you can expect someone who cannot find decent health care for his or her kids to have any sort of obligations toward the state. The business elites and the CC, I think, I don't know, I'll be only speculating. But I think there is an interlocking set of interests. And my conjecture is that they would support a CC if their interests are safeguarded. That's pure rationality. And I think that the old elite, business elite, the old / new business elite would support CC. Your next question, I was not sure I understood your question, is why they do repeat elections. Because in the for the past year, the elections were purely reactions to pressure from the street. People wanted elections now because they did not want the SCAF to rule. Now, I think today they are obliged by the international community, and this goes back to what Stephan said. I think the international community has a big question mark on what's Egypt, what is going on in Egypt. And the only way for them to deal with Egypt is to have some sort of ballot box. They want to see a ballot box. They want to see some sort of something that is quote unquote legitimate for them. So I think that, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
I think exactly it's all about legitimacy. So
exactly.
They want to show that they are legitimized to lead
and
the country.
if you listen to the government propaganda in the state papers and the state radio, state news, TV, the message is very clear. Go out and vote. This is the legitimacy of July 3rd. This is the legitimacy of June 30th. The short term, there are lots. The short term, you cannot say, you cannot do a quick fix without giving the big picture. I think my claim is the following. I think if you tell Egyptians it's going to be a tough ride, but later we'll get there, I think they will believe. I think if you tell them if we need to jack up the price of gasoline for a few years, I think we need to, but in the same time, it's a quid pro quo, okay? And I think in the public sphere in Egypt, we were not giving the right debate. I think we should have proposed to the Egyptians, here is it. The government has £1. I can give you the £1 to subsidize your gasoline, or I can give you the £1 in a cash transfer, or I can give you the £1 and build a new highway. I think this type of debate has never been in the public sphere of Egypt. I don't think we provided Egyptians with the alternatives. So my claim is the following. If I'm the prime minister, I'm going to tell them this is ABC the problem. In order to solve ABC, we need to do this and this. It's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough medicine in the beginning. Inshallah, it's going to be better. And my claim is that the Egyptians will believe me if I am legitimate and trustworthy. Big, big if. I don't know what the future holds. If I knew the future, I'll be making lots of money. So, but that's not the case. So, I think we're living it day by day, and there are lots of weights. And my only my only conjecture, my only fact is that it's going to get better. How? I don't know. But it's going to get better. You have to trust me on this. About Dubai and... I'm sorry? Yes, that's another way to look at it. Yes. When I was teaching my students the Global Competitiveness Report, and when we ranked rock bottom when it comes to education, and they were very pessimistic in the classroom, I told them, well, you know what? It can only get better than this. There's no khalas. We've reached the rock bottom. It can only get better.
I think there is some space.
There is indeed. And the other point was that some countries were not there in the list in the first place, so at least we're better in some countries. The development aid, I'm personally skeptical of development aid because it's unless it feeds the national agenda, then in some sort of because the literature said that it's always tied to political interest, and you've mentioned that even it comes from the European Union, from the US, it's tied to political interest. So I'm personally skeptical of foreign aid. I think it can help in infrastructure. I think it can help with capacity building. I think it can definitely help with transparency, with governance. These are the areas that it can help with. But it has to be within a national agenda. It has to be some sort of, this is what we need from you, so can you help us with this? Can you help us with elections? Can you help us with monitoring elections? Can you help us with creating a database of poverty? These sorts of things. I think I covered everything. Thank you.
Yeah, I think most points are answered. I think your question is very interesting, the implications of development aid on the current social contract. I think the problem is if development aid is substituting the state functions, then it becomes highly problematic because the state can use the money for other for other things to increase the budget for the police or the military or whatever. So this is something where, from an external perspective, we have to be very, very careful. Yeah, the IMF conditions. I think also the IMF has learned a lot. So I wouldn't compare the current, let's say, IMF contracts with the contracts in the 1990s, but I see it exactly the same as you described it. It was highly problematic for Egypt because the IMF pushed a lot for privatization, and privatization cannot be the answer in such an intransparent and yeah, to say it bluntly, corrupt setting. So it was absolutely a wrong advice. But my impression now from the negotiations, I'm also not an insider, so I can only say what I read in our media and what I heard from France is that they tried to be very smart to Egypt, and they offered a lot. So they offered maybe more than they offered to other countries. So the conditions seem to be quite favorable for Egypt, and I think it was absolutely the wrong decision that SCAF and then even Morsi rejected the IMF package. And by the way, when we talk about IMF aid, we not talk about 4.8 billion or something like that. This is the original IMF package, but the whole package, because there are other funds related to this IMF deal, the whole package is maybe about 10 to 14 billion. So it's really a huge one. Yeah, why the alliance between business and business elite of the Mubarak era and Sisi? This is a quite interesting question because I think it's a very interesting alliance. I see that there are some interlinkages. And I think it's a quite interesting alliance because the interests of both actors groups are not so homogeneous or not so similar. Of course, they don't want to lose power. Of course, this is maybe the main thing which unifies the interests. But in the 1990s, we saw that there were many battles between the military elite and the business elite. because the business elite was not so happy with the military interference in economic affairs and so on. So it's a very fragile alliance for sure. Yeah, what about the future? Unfortunately, I don't know. So I really would hesitate to answer on this.
I think this is a characteristic of the future, that we don't know much about it. I think we have reached a very good temperature now in this room, despite the cold weather. But the problem is that the food is getting cold, and I would like to invite you now all. Thank you very much for a very lively debate. Thank you again, Dr. Samar, for joining us here. Thank you, Dr. Stephan Roll. Thank you for coming from Germany, especially for this talk. And let me just thank two people. I think the first one, who is always very busy, he already ran out. It's Christian Melchert. Despite rescheduling this talk 3 times, he supported us with all his hands. And let me thank also Tamer and all the technical staff for this support. I think all the mics were working, and that's very good, and we have a very good technician. Thank you very much, and hope to see you.